All right, so Mona, so before we got cut off, you were explaining something very interesting about how the media elevates Iranian dissidents to sometimes weaponize uh, half truths or problems that does affect the country. And you were about to get into a very interesting explanation about how America and its allies, Canada and so forth, Israel and the United Kingdom, how they've sort of been, grooming Western audiences to be anti-Iran, very hostile towards Iran. So go ahead and
Yes, and then I started talking about the public inquiry into foreign interference
yes,
that Canada had. Uh, it was during my vice presidency with the ICC, so it was a couple of years ago at this point, I think. Uh, Timelines tend to be fuzzy for me. So much has been
Trudeau
happening in
was
the
still the
last
prime
couple of years.
minister.
But yes. Um, and, this inquiry had the usual suspect state enemies, um, you know, being inquired into in terms of China, Russia. I think India was on there, and Iran was added actually by some other diaspora Iranian groups. Um, and what was interesting, ICC joined this, and we had a bit of a different argument in terms of the inquiry was interested in state actors as well as non-state actors who, but by the definition, they had to have state funding. So we thought it would be interesting to bring in the MEK, which has been doing, doing sort of this political relationship building with the not only the Republicans in the U.S., but also different Canadian politicians as well have had visits with them and so on. And it's like, what's with that, right? Which, in case the audience, maybe not everyone is familiar,
Yeah,
this is an opposition group, which used to be listed as a terrorist group, I think, by the U.S. and Canada,
yeah.
but at some point got taken off. Interestingly enough, for no like it. I think the history of that. There's no particular reason for this. It just,
And there,
you know,
and the MEK is a Iranian Kurdish separatist movement, and
uh,
during the very brutal war between Iraq and Iran, they sided with Saddam Hussein, and even after that war, they have done several terrorist attacks in Iran. Correct?
yes. So they have done terrorist attacks, but I think the Kurdish aspect there, no, I don't think that's the case. There are Kurdish separatist groups, but the MEK specifically, it's very funny because we talk about Islamo-communism or Islamo-Marxism, and they are an actual supposed Islamist Marxist group, which
Oh,
my
that's news to
understand.
me.
Yes, so that's their history. They were a militant group, but they tend to operate as a cult. And if you do any type of research into this, they have quite strange policies. And I don't think that that Marxist communist history element is necessarily what they're genuinely motivated by right now. They're an opposition group. They have a history of terrorist operations, and they ended up. My understanding is they fled to Iraq at a certain point in history, and then later to Albania. When I don't, and my current understanding is that I don't think the Albanians really want them there. Um,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
so they have these camps and they have recruitment and folks who have family members who have joined that group have a very hard time establishing any form of communication with these family members, as they're kind of inculcated into this.
But it's interesting because they do get money from the United States, from semi NGOs, and they do get money from the Saudi Arabian states, from the French state, and so forth like that. That's not considered collusion, though. But your organization, completely independent, though, I'm pretty sure you guys have
Yeah.
been accused many times of being agents of the Islamic Republic of Iran or whomever
Yep.
big boogeyman,
Yep.
correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But just to wrap up about the Foreign Interference Commission, we brought this up. We also brought up the United States and Israel as factors, but and argued against the framework that these countries are allies. We don't consider them foreign interferers. But interestingly, we got access to certain documents heavily redacted from the CSIS and so on, and there was a little bit about Iran in there, and it's just like Iran. Part of the investigation was around election interference, and there was no finding about Iran there. Iran does not interfere in Canadian elections, and very minor notes about okay, there may be some. This is a story, but with this idea that the IRGC is kind of sort of spying on Iranians here, and this was something that was brought up by I forgot his name, but this look, it's there are these funded groups that are creating this narrative. So that was an interesting experience there. And, sort of fast forward to today, what I think the argument that I was trying to make is, actually I was at an event last week on Tuesday, I believe, in Montreal, large event, I think, and it was, the title of the event was Resistance Against the Far Right and Fascism. And interestingly enough, hosted by Nima Mashouf, and who is a person who is in opposition to the current board of the Congress. But what I wanted to bring up is that a certain one of the guests, I think, or I had two quotes from two of the speakers, one of whom was Rima Hassan, who was blocked into entry into Canada. Understanding is like CJO had some involvement in this. She's a French politician, and then I heard she was also arrested after that, or had some case brought against her, which probably spurious, related to her activism for Palestine. But she talked about sort of being frustrated with, I'm paraphrasing, but sort of leftist collaborators, and or some kind of false left.
Yeah.
And there was another speaker. Unfortunately, I don't have my notes right now, but I'll bring it up shortly. But
sure.
He said that he what brought us here is not like the fascists, but rather certain people who prepared the way, who paved the way for that. So I think we can talk about sort of the same left collaborators, or various types of maybe not all left, but sort of folks who were critical of Iran for different reasons, and this comes back to ICC's standpoint. The reason why ICC does not go hard on critiquing Iran, it's not that we don't have criticisms of the Iranian government. Any Iranian and any person who lives in any country, who has some understanding or analysis of politics, is going to have criticisms of the government. That's just how things work. Like, nothing's ever perfect. So, of course, of course we have criticism of the Iranian government. The reason that we don't, that's not our primary discussion point is because we're aware that this narrative of demonization already exists, to such an extent that there are no diplomatic relationships, right? So what else is Canada going to do? Now we've started that war, and that's something that we've been trying to fight because we're aware of these discursive elements that have led up to this. So, and our primary interlocutor is the Canadian government. So we need to criticize our government where we live, where we can have an impact, because in the end we do believe that isolating Iran or isolating any country is not the answer. And one of our key position points for the last several years has been sanctions, which we consider to be economic warfare. There's studies on how sanctions impact common people, working people, and the mechanism through which sanctions actually are designed to operate is to make people so miserable that they will, then rebel against their government, which we saw sort of that happen with the currency collapse in January, which was also, I forgot his name, but the currency minister, the economic minister of the United States. I keep on repeating these names, and it's like
don't worry, it's okay.
Right now, I've got Pete Hegseth on the brain because he's another one. The economic minister, he said that, we're doing a great job in Iran. We wanted to create a dollar shortage in the country. Now that's happened. And so they, speak with bluster about these things. And yet the media narrative that we get is always, Iran is bad. Iran is, doing these horrible things to, its people, protesters, and so on. And missing that part of the very important part of the situation where a lot of the problems are either created deliberately or encouraged by the fact that Iran has simply just been in opposition to the United States since the revolution because of the foreign meddling and interference that the United States has had in that country with the coup, as you know, in 1953, the coup against Mossadegh and the placing of the last Shah, who had to run away because, he...
That's by Britain and France
exactly.
And
Britain,
Canada
France,
as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the CIA and allies, right? So, this is the history that it has to be repeated. Unfortunately, we have to keep repeating this because the majority of average Canadians and people in the Western world don't know this history.
Well, that's a perfect segue then to this question. I'm actually gonna I'm gonna combine these two questions. So here it goes. Which is, I'm curious your assessment of the decade-long campaign to scare people about Iran's nuclear program. Why do you think Iran is being singled out for not being allowed to make a nuclear weapon, even though Iran is not interested in making nuclear weapons? So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And then before the U.S. and Israel's murderous attacks on Iran, there have been several murders of Iranian scientists. And you already mentioned that there's been economic sanctions, economic sabotage towards Iran for, again, making non-existent nuclear weapons. Can you talk to us also about the sanctions and the socioeconomic pain that's been inflicted on the largely Iranian working class and precarious middle class?
Mm-hmm. So, big questions. This is great. So as you said, non-existent nuclear weapons, it's the same exact story that we saw with Iraq, the WMDs, which in the end, where were they? Oh, sorry, we made a mistake. Too late, I guess. Uh, you know, tens of thousands of innocent civilian Iraqis were killed, and they go in. And what's crazy is that unlike Bush, who was I keep talking about this. Is that like we're living in this crazy masks off world where there used to be some semblance of decorum about things and a need to craft a narrative. And I remember, I was a teenager at the time, and I remember, Michael Moore was like, the cool American guy who was,
Yes,
I
remember those
speaking about these things and saying, it's all about the oil, it's all about Halliburton and these companies that, Bush had relationships with, as I understand it, and now, they don't even try to hide that, Trump is just saying, yeah, we're going to get a lot of oil. Like, with Venezuela, right? I believe he just says that outright, and we're going to make so much money. It's just like, it completely baffles the mind. In a way, I'm hopeful that this masks off moment is going to, lead to more and more people becoming aware of things. And I think they are. I saw, other social media posts, people share these around where, it's an American man saying, people in other countries say death to America. And he was saying, I think that, like, it's crazy. This, the way, America, the government of the United States has intervened in so many countries in its history, but is now doing so without even trying to convince its own population that it should be. Like, my understanding is there's 20-30% of Americans supporting the war with Iran, like at the beginning of it. I don't know if they're gonna do, some things to sort of shift that in a certain direction, because it looks like the war is not ending as soon as they had hoped. But it's
and talk a bit more about the impact of sanctions, economic terrorism that's been inflicted on Iranians, because I find there's been so little coverage and details of that.
Yeah. So back when, as I mentioned, that moment when Soleimani was assassinated, General Soleimani, in, I don't remember the exact year, but it was in Trump's first term. It would have been about 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And at that time, sanctions were, already an issue that was impacting folks, and that was something that I was concerned about. And I was invited to a media interview just as an Iranian Canadian on CBC Daybreak Radio with Mike Finnerty, and it was the same thing. There were two of us, two Iranians Canadians with different perspectives, and I was talking about the impact of sanctions, and my grandmother on my father's side has passed away, and I'd spoken to my father about her. He went to be with her in the last toward the end of her life, but he was saying they couldn't find, like, she was incontinent, she was very old. She couldn't find diapers on the market for her. Or there's a number of different medications that people with specific conditions cannot access. Even though Iran as a society, despite the sanctions, has succeeded in developing a lot of homegrown industries, there are certain things, of course, that are difficult to access. Actually, let me talk about COVID.
Go ahead.
Iranians made their own COVID vaccine, which came a bit later than the first ones from those big companies. I don't remember Moderna or whatever their
Yeah,
names were.
yeah,
And Iran was accused of hacking into the whatever database for the vaccine development of these companies, right? Which I think is absolutely insane. Like, if they did that, great. The vaccine should be free. The vaccine should be freely distributed across the world because this is a world pandemic, and the health impacts on they're not localized, right? They affect people without discrimination, and it's absolutely ludicrous. Like, so, in the United States, we have this, health industry that is fully private.
exactly.
They have some form of Medicare, but it's very limited, and the
Exactly.
regulations around it are very complicated in terms of people getting access. And there's like
Exactly.
honestly a crisis with that. And then,
But
and then like this idea that Iran is at fault for this intellectual property stealing
yeah,
intellectual property, like when there's much bigger human concerns at stake. So that's a very specific issue that I wanted to bring to light. But like, sanctions affect common everyday people, and you have health impacts. There's a study by the Lancet about health outcomes due to sanctions. That's kind of one of the key, like, I think, arguments here that I hope
have
will
they done
reach people.
and have they done one on Iran? The Lancet on the impact of sanctions on Iran.
I don't know. That one was a general study that I think I don't necessarily have time to go deep into these studies, but it is it's something that's well known.
Okay. Wow.
And there's other studies just about how it increases the wealth disparity, right, between the rich and the poor. So, what will happen? And one of the things that people in Iran as well, people will when I was traveled there, talk to folks, talk to family, and people say there's corruption in the government. Of course, corruption is not something that's purely an Iranian issue. Obviously, it occurs throughout the world. We know that, oh my goodness, Netanyahu has a corruption scandal that people say, the part of the motivation for the genocide was to stay in power to avoid these issues. And, with the Epstein files, there's this absolutely insane situation with the top officials in the US and, very high level people involved in these human trafficking scandals. And, okay, corruption, but that's something that sanctions actually enable by making it difficult for people to access goods through normal channels. So
it creates the black market.
Exactly, there's a differential access to that market because prices are high on the black market too. So if you have access to means and you have access and you have connections, then you're able to survive. But if you're not, you're a person who's poor, who doesn't have connections, who then you're really gonna suffer, right?
Wow, that's incredible. Thanks for sharing all of that. In fact, this is a good segue then to this question. Now, the war drums beating towards, and also I also just want to say something. when it comes to like, look, I wish that, or I wish all countries didn't have nuclear weapons. Period. Chemical weapons, biological weapons. But if Israel is allowed to be nuclear armed, Iran is allowed to be nuclear armed. If America, France, and Britain are allowed to have nuclear weapons, Iran has the right to nuclear weapons. And while those countries are attacking Iran, Iran has the right to protect it, to defend itself. Now, segue into this question. The war drums beating towards Iran has been a nearly 2 decades long process, and there's been tons of major Hollywood and British movies in which Iran is, on Iran, in which Iran is featured in widely watched TV programs. All of it saying to audiences, largely Western audiences, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is uniquely evil, like what you were saying about the corruption. It's uniquely Iranian and so forth. And I think I think movies, like Argo, by Ben Affleck, which got an Oscar for Best Picture, and it was co-presented by Michelle Obama, funnily enough. Then there's this film called Desert Dancer, which, end of the movie, the Iranian character who's performing in France or someplace is demanding that the Western audiences do something, to the Islamic Republic of Iran because it's uniquely oppressive. Jon Stewart, the overrated satirist and the host of The Daily Show, he shot a movie called Rosewater, in which, funnily enough, a Mexican actor is playing an Iranian. And that film was based on the memoir of an Iranian Canadian journalist, Mazir Bahari. I believe that's how, I believe that's his name. And then there are also Iranians from Iran, like the popular filmmaker Jafar Panahi's. Is that how you say his name?
Oh, actually, unfortunately, I'm not as familiar
Okay, no
with
problem, no
Iranian cinema
problem.
to know all of the names, but
Oh, no problem. But
yeah.
anyways, there's this very popular like Iranian filmmaker and some other Iranian diaspora folks who all of them are advocating for, if not full on war on Iran, for more economic terrorism sanctions. And there are these two Anglo-Iranian stand-up comedians, Amid Jali, and another one, Uh, uh, Shapi Korsanzi. Forgive me if I'm butchering their names. And she, 3 to 4 years ago, this was 3 or 4 years into the Iraq War. She made a joke in her stand-up saying, "People often confuse Iraqis for Iranians all the time, but I'm here to clarify for all of you, we are the ones that actually have weapons of mass destruction." So I'm, I'm, I'm curious your response to that before we talk about the pro-Iran war demonstrations. I'm very curious your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, so the comedian, I don't know. I don't know what she was trying to do with that, whether she was trying to foment that narrative. I actually hadn't heard of her before. But the films, I haven't seen them all. I have seen Argo. But I had also rewatched Persepolis recently. Actually, just a few days ago. And this one is interesting because it's not. It is a little bit also critical of, she ends up moving to she ends up in the end moving to France, but first to Austria, and she becomes homeless for a certain period of time. And when she goes back to Iran, she says, in the West you can die in the streets and no one would care, right? So she says that. But what's interesting about this one, I read the graphic novel when I was in high school, and it was my first exposure to knowing that there were communists involved in the Iranian Revolution. Because prior to that, I was familiar with the religious narrative and
Persepolis is the name of this movie?
Persepolis. So there's a graphic novel by Marjan Satrapi.
Okay.
I believe there were 2 volumes, and there's also a film which is based on the same graphic novel. And she's based in France, so that is important, I think.
Interesting. I'm gonna check that out.
But the criticism that I have is that the entire movie, or like the life it shows that she had in Tehran, growing up during the Iran-Iraq War, growing up, when she was, I guess the revolution happened when she was quite young, and then during the Iran-Iraq War, she, she has family members who are communists and so on. But the entirety of the movie takes place in the city. And so the question is, what about all the rural folks and their perspectives? And there's also no sympathetic discussion of the folks with the religious views. And so there's a complete narrative that is missing there. And so, in the end, she ends up sort of critical of, her family sends her off because they say, oh, you're not made for the Iran of today, and she talks about sort of, you're too free, but she talks about freedom in that Western liberal sense of individual freedom and, wanting to listen to Western music and all of this. And, the freedom, we talk about this issue of freedom to and freedom from, but what about the freedom from, Western imperialism, which, of course she talks about, the Shah was awful, all that. But, there's definitely something missing there. And that kind of is a good segue into talking about why the outcome was what it was. Because the vast majority of Iranians, had religious values, and communism was sort of a foreign concept to a lot of people. Like I have family stories of folks immigrating down from, now I'm talking about my family history, but, the Soviet-occupied Azerbaijan, because they couldn't practice their religion there. And, there are mistakes, of course, made in any revolution, in any, whenever the society is building something new, there's no template, right? So try things.
But only France is allowed to make those mistakes, not Russia or Iran or any Latin American.
And it's important because Iran's revolution happened within living memory. There needs to be time for things to develop in a certain direction, and it's always been in in this struggle, this opposition against like the extremely powerful United States. The United Nations is not, unfortunately, egalitarian. There's veto rights and the Security Commission and so on. There's only certain states involved. And now there's been this, rebuilding of, a multipolar world with BRICS and all. But so, yes, so I was saying that, that narrative, even sort of the more, perhaps, I don't know, critical left, yes. Yeah. It's missing some aspects. And I wanted to talk about this concept of Westoxification that came about. People were sort of talking about it at those times, but the author who kind of made it famous was Jalal al-Ahmad. He wrote kind of like a short little treatise, and like if you read the sort of intro or abstract, he's kind of like, oh, that's just kind of done quickly, but if I were to rewrite it now, I'd have to rewrite again. But it's just like these ideas, and the main argument is this Westoxification is that obvious, and this was pre-revolution, right? So Jalal al-Ahmad, he was at various points members of various left communist parties. He was a member of the Tudeh party at some point, and later he kind of came back and became more religious because there's this idea of like returning to the source, returning to the roots of what is Iranian society. And Iranian society, unlike what the the monarchists want to tell you, is not colonized by Islam or had a Islamic government forced upon it. Iranian Iranians have been Muslim for 1400 years. Iranian, or maybe a little bit less than that. That's the advent of Islam, but and there was a relationship built during various periods of time. Iran was a center, the hub of trade across Asia into the Mediterranean, and there was kind of a dialectic relationship between Iranian culture and Islamic culture. And in Islamic culture, the broader Islamic culture was influenced by things that existed in Iran at the time. And at the same time, we had, during this golden age of Islam, we had all these scholars, and Islam was not.
And also one of the five pillars of Islam, like now me putting my criticisms of the Islamic Republic aside and groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, and so forth, but I do know that one of the five pillars of Islam is helping out the poor and helping out the needy. So there is a social justice, economic justice element to Islam, correct? And in the Iran that existed under the Western-backed Shah, while one may applaud some of the feminism and some of the secularism that did exist at the time, there was a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. It was only certain areas that had this sort of kind of wonderful Westernism, but in much of the rural areas and much of the places outside of Tehran, there was pretty grotesque poverty and so forth like that. The Shah eradicated. He didn't want any left rivals, so he eradicated anyone who was a supporter of Mossadegh, anyone who was a communist, anyone who just wanted, basic socialist reforms. And then with that, you had, the rise of Ayatollah Khamenei. What's also interesting, though, is that the U.S. under Jimmy Carter, Britain under Thatcher, and even France under, I believe, both Mitterrand and Chirac, and even and the country of Germany at the time, they all thought, okay, we actually can deal with Ayatollah Khamenei. We actually can deal with him. Who cares about the Shah if he gets overthrown? We'll just deal with this guy. And in the moment Ayatollah Khamenei talks about, you guys have to stop exploiting our oil and you have to pay back for that. And then, of course, when he started talking about his hostility towards Zionism and talked about spreading the Islamic Shia revolution globally, that was when the U.S. was like, oh, okay, we cannot deal with this guy. And then, and then from there comes the Iran-Iraq war with Saddam Hussein, also backed by the USSR, trying to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then even then, there's also lots of funny stuff because the U.S. was also, the Reagan administration was in touch with Ayatollah Khamenei, saying to him to keep the hostages, only release them until I become president. And then Israel thought that Saddam Hussein was too pro-Palestinian, and they secretly were giving weapons to the Islamic Republic of Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the U.S. backstabbed Saddam Hussein because they secretly were also giving weapons to the Islamic Republic of Iran so that they could continue their atrocious genocidal war in Central America, namely Nicaragua. So it's all, it's so...
Yeah.
So political, and curious your response on that.
Well, there was definitely a lot there, so we could talk about all of these things for a very long time. But what I kind of pick up is, yes, so there was this, the reason Mossadegh was, overthrown, I think because of this sort of Red Scare, he was considered to be a communist. I don't know if he was fully a communist, but these sort of leftist ideas, he was going to nationalize the oil, and you talked about a social justice aspect within Islam, yeah. And I think that's key, and it's something that I come back to when I in my sort of history of developing as an activist and so on. One time I was in a workshop where I was asked to draw a tree, like my roots, my trunk, and my branches, and how, in terms of like me as a person, who
Yeah.
strives for social justice. And in my roots, I put Shiism, Islam, Imam Hussein as a key factor in my understanding of social justice. I don't know if I should talk about the story of Hussein, and but it's a key. It's a key. It's very key.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
It's very key to Iranian identity. So Hussein was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and so sort of the difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam is the Shiites believed in 12 descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, they're called 12er Shiism. There's maybe some other branches where they only go up to the 7th or something. But that's, the dominant religion in Iran is Shiism, belief in 12 descendants of the Prophet who have sort of a holy, attribute to them, and they are venerated. And so the third descendant, so the first was Ali, who was actually the Prophet's son-in-law, and then from him you have Hassan and Hussein, who were brothers, and then Hussein being the third Shia imam. There's this famous Battle of Karbala that is narrated in the history, where Karbala is a town in Iraq, right? Because, the Islamic society was throughout these regions. And so the history states that he was invited to this city because the ruler of the city, by the name of Yazid, was cruel, and people were looking for help. So he went there with actually, a small number of people, including women and children.
Yeah.
And I think there were, a larger number of them, but he ends up with 72 left because he tells people, because Yazid actually, gets wind of this, and he decides to fight him in battle. And he's left with 72 close companions, where the rest, were like, okay, no, we don't want to we don't want to die, we're gonna go away. He tells them at night, it's night now, you can leave, no one's gonna see. So, and these 72 people get murdered in the Battle of Karbala, and then and the intent was for him to originally help the people of that city. And there's all these stories around how, the water was cut off, and there was cruelty towards the women and children, and Abul Fazl, who's Hussein's brother, goes to get water for the children, and he's, holding it in one hand. Some of this, I don't know, to what extent it's history and to what extent it's embellished through time, but he picks up the water through with one hand, and he gets confronted by the enemy army, and they cut off his arm, and he picks it up with his other hand, they cut off the other arm, and so in the end he picks it up with his teeth, and he stops at first. He's going to drink some water himself, but he said, no, how can I drink water if the children can't drink water, right? And then so he picks it up with teeth, and they kill him. And there's a lot of narrations around this history, and it all comes down to they died. Hussein died. Abul Faz died. All his companions died for the cause of justice. And the way in which, for instance, Abul Faz was martyred, Hussein also, was sort of dismembered and all this, speaks to a story, a truth that comes down to, this is the way one should live, and this is the way one should die. And so, this is how
oneself for the greater good,
and this is why, this is how I see Palestine, for instance, right? People in Palestine are dying for their resistance, just to, have the land that they have lived on for generations. And the way, the genocide has unfolded in the last couple of years, and there's been international outcry, and yet, it was allowed to continue because of the failure of this system of, international law. The genocide commission, the findings that there might be a genocide, is it intended to stop genocide? And yet, it's allowed to continue. And now they have this new law that the Knesset passed about, the destruction of, the capital punishment for Palestinian prisoners who, we can call them hostages, right? Because sometimes they're captured on very spurious grounds, right? Just kind of arbitrarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this has deep roots, and the relationship of that the Iranian state has formulated towards Palestine is based in this deep understanding of social justice, I think, right?
And then
So
interestingly enough, I was watching Modern Rebels, which was done by Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, Ben Norton, who now does his own geopolitical program, and they were interviewing an Iranian. I don't remember what his background was, but they were interviewing an Iranian, and the Iranian was explaining to them about the political system in Iran, and he was saying that that the Iranian electorate sometimes is between a rock and a hard place. So the parties that are more secular or feminist and and want to advance more minority rights, they tend to those kind of socially liberal parties tend to, however, advance more neoliberalism and so forth like that. Whereas the parties that tend to be, very, strict, wanting very much to conserve, the Islamic Republic and the ideas of Ayatollah Khamenei, they tend to be much more left when it comes to socio-economic matters and so forth. So oftentimes, Iranians have to choose between a rock and a hard place. Like, do I want more freedom when it comes to, lifting the veil or so forth like that, or do I want my my life or my family to be better in terms of like social mobility, economic justice, and so forth? Very curious your response
yes,
before I get. Yeah.
I don't
Uh-oh.
know if you're cut off again. I
Oh
don't know
no, no,
why
no, no! It might
I
cut
hear
off
me just
again.
cut off. I'm gonna just
Oh
I'm gonna
no.
wait. Oh, okay, okay. Well, I can hear you now.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Uh-oh. Hold on, folks. We will be
I
right back.
I I wonder if memory